April 12, 1945. Philadelphia. Federal Building on Market Street. 11:47 p.m. Merritt Kincaid sat behind the oak desk in his office on the 7th floor and stared at the telephone that hadn't rung for 3 hours. The entire city held its breath. Radio broadcasts delivered updates from Warm Springs, Georgia, but everyone understood what they meant. An era was ending. The massive office building felt like a mausoleum tonight, empty corridors echoing with the footsteps of night watchmen and the occasional clerk burning midnight oil. The office was silent except for the ticking of a brass clock on the mantelpiece, a gift from the Secretary of War himself after Merritt's munitions designs had exceeded all production targets. Through the window, the lights of Philadelphia stretched to the horizon, a city of 2 million souls waiting for news that would reshape the world. Then the door opened without a knock. No secretary's warning, no courtesy call. Just the sudden intrusion of cold air from the hallway and a presence that made Merritt's skin prickle. A man stood in the doorway wearing a threadbare coat that had seen better decades, his face weathered by time and something harder than weather. Not age alone. This was the face of someone who'd been broken and poorly reassembled. He looked at Merritt with a long, measuring gaze, eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the plush office, the expensive furniture, the framed commendations on the walls. When he spoke, his voice was a rasp, like someone who'd forgotten how to use it properly. "Hello, Dalton." Merritt went pale. The pen in his hand clattered to the desk. He hadn't heard that name in 8 years. Nobody knew his real name was Dalton. Nobody in Washington, nobody in Philadelphia, nobody in the entire federal apparatus that employed him. His personnel file, verified and re-verified through multiple security clearances, stated unequivocally, Merritt Ashford Kincaid, born October 7, 1910, Reading, Pennsylvania. Only child. No siblings. Mother deceased 1928. Father killed in France 1918. A flawless biography for a government official. Clean, verified, documented, false from beginning to end. The man walked slowly into the office, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. His footsteps were quiet, but each one hammered in Merritt's skull like a judge's gavel. He moved like someone who'd learned to make himself small, to occupy minimal space, to avoid drawing attention. Prison posture. Merritt recognized it from the few times he'd visited correctional facilities on government business. Quote 1, the stranger said, settling into the visitor's chair with the careful movements of someone whose body hurt constantly. "I came to tell you something. Your brother is alive, and he's here, in Philadelphia." Merritt wanted to speak, but his throat constricted. Brother? What brother? Officially, Deputy Director Merritt Ashford Kincaid of the War Production Board had never had a brother. His personnel file stated it clearly in multiple places, verified by background investigators who'd interviewed neighbors in Reading, checked birth records, cross-referenced census data. Only child. The phrase appeared 17 times in his security clearance file. He'd counted them once, late at night, alone in this office, trying to convince himself the lie had become truth through repetition. "I don't understand what you're talking about," Merritt said, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. Years of presenting to generals and senators had taught him to control his vocal cords even when his heart was racing. The stranger smiled crookedly, revealing teeth that had seen inadequate dental care for years. "You understand perfectly. October 7, 1910, in Reading, Pennsylvania. Arthur Kincaid and his wife Nora had identical twin boys, born 5 minutes apart in a row house on Chestnut Street. Dalton came first, then Merritt. 2 drops of water. Even your own mother couldn't tell you apart without checking the birthmarks. Dalton had one on his left shoulder blade, Merritt on his right. Grew up together, went to the same schools, worked at the same steel mill. 2 halves of one whole. Until 1937. And then one of you was taken." Merritt gripped the armrests of his leather chair until his knuckles whitened. The stranger knew too much, details that weren't in any file, weren't recorded anywhere except in the fading memories of people who'd known them as children. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 5, underscore, underscore. His voice came out sharper than intended, the voice of authority he used with subordinates. But this man didn't flinch. Someone who knew both of you. Someone who worked with Merritt in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Someone who held his hand when he was dying of pneumonia in the winter of 1943, watching his breath rattle in his chest, watching the prison doctor shake his head and walk away because there were 50 other men dying that week and not enough medicine for any of them. Someone who heard him whisper a name with his last breath. Dalton. He said, "Tell Dalton." I held on for him. Tell him that. The stranger pulled a crumpled photograph from his coat pocket, edges worn soft from handling, and placed it on the desk with the reverence of someone laying flowers on a grave. Merritt looked and felt his stomach drop into a void. The photo showed him. Or rather, not him. A man with his exact face but impossibly thin, cheekbones sharp as blades, eyes sunken into skull sockets, skin the color of old newspaper. Wearing horizontal prison stripes, black and white, the uniform of federal incarceration. A placard hung across his chest on a chain. Kincaid, Merritt A. Sedition Act violation, 15 years. The photo had been taken against a height chart, 5'10". Same height as Merritt. The number beneath the name, 47829. A prisoner reduced to digits. This was taken in November of 1942, the stranger explained, his voice taking on the careful cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this speech many times. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 9, underscore, underscore. Merritt's hands trembled. He clasped them together on the desk, trying to project calm authority, but they shook like leaves in a storm. Why are you telling me this? The stranger stood slowly, joints creaking audibly in the silent office. Because he asked me to. 2 years after they said he died, after I'd been released and made it back to Philadelphia, I met a man in a veterans shelter. Thin, sick, coughing blood into rags. Same face as this photo, but 20 pounds lighter. He told me a story. About 2 brothers. About a choice one made and the other accepted. About 8 years in hell for a crime he didn't commit. He said, "Find him. Find Dalton. Tell him I'm alive. Tell him I'm coming. Not for revenge, not for justice, just for truth. Because before I die, I need to know, which one of us am I? Did we switch places, or am I the one who was always supposed to be here, dying in a charity bed, and he's the imposter?" The door closed with a soft click. The stranger was gone, dissolving into the dark hallway like a ghost returning to wherever ghosts live. Merritt sat alone in the vast office overlooking nighttime Philadelphia, the photograph clutched in his trembling hands. His brother's face, or his own face, impossible to say which, stared up at him with an expression of such profound exhaustion it transcended accusation. This wasn't anger. This was the look of someone who'd been ground down to nothing by machinery too vast to fight, too pervasive to escape. Merritt walked to the window with mechanical steps. 7 floors below, Market Street stretched into darkness, headlights tracing paths through the city like blood through veins. Somewhere out there, in this metropolitan maze of 2 million souls, among the boarding houses and shelters and back alleys, walked a man with his face. A man who shouldn't exist according to official records. A man who'd been declared dead in 1943, buried in a pauper's grave in Kansas, file closed and archived. A man who knew the only secret capable of destroying everything Merritt had built over 8 years of relentless climbing. And the worst part, the part that made Merritt's chest constrict with something between terror and recognition, he knew the stranger spoke truth. He felt it in his marrow. His brother was alive. The game had just begun, and Merritt had no idea what the rules were or how it would end. 8 years earlier, August 1937, Reading, Pennsylvania. Bethlehem Steelworks, 3rd shift ending at midnight. Two identical men stood by the factory gate watching the moon rise through industrial smoke. Merritt lit a lucky strike while Dalton studied the sky where storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, backlit by the last purple glow of sunset. Quote, _12, Dalton said, the observation of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, who could read weather in the smell of the air and the behavior of birds. Fall's coming early this year. Probably a hard winter. Merritt nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere, 300 miles southeast, in Washington, D.C., where his future waited in a manila envelope on someone's desk. He was thinking about the letter at home in his desk drawer, hidden under old tax returns and his mother's death certificate. Letter from the War Department. Not an offer yet, just an inquiry. They were building munitions factories, preparing for a war everyone knew was coming, even if nobody would say it out loud. They needed engineers. Young men with clean backgrounds and technical skills. Merritt's night school degree in mechanical engineering had caught someone's attention. The letter said, "We are considering your candidacy for a position in the Ordnance Division. Please complete the attached security questionnaire and return it within 30 days. Only one problem. The questionnaire had 17 pages and asked about everything: political affiliations, foreign contacts, financial debts, criminal records, family members. Especially family members. List all siblings, living or deceased. List all parents, living or deceased. List all aunts, uncles, cousins who might pose security concerns. The government wanted to know everything about everyone you'd ever known. And Dalton was a problem. Not because anything was wrong with him. Dalton was the better man in most ways. Stronger, kinder, more honest. But because there were two of them. Identical twins. Same face, same voice, same fingerprints nearly. Same everything except the 5-minute gap between births and the position of their birthmarks. In those years, as war approached and paranoia spread like fog through the valleys, twins aroused suspicion in certain circles. Doubles. Identical faces. It raised questions about identity, about substitution, about the possibility of espionage through impersonation. Merritt had heard stories, whispered over beers in the mill canteen. Twins working for foreign governments, one infiltrating while the other provided cover. Probably nonsense, probably paranoia fed by too many spy novels. But the fact remained. If Merritt wanted to pass a federal security clearance, wanted to work on classified projects, wanted access to restricted facilities and secret information, he needed a simple background. No complications, no questions. An only child whose parents were conveniently dead and couldn't contradict anything he claimed. "Listen," Merritt began, but Dalton was already looking at him with that expression Merritt had seen 1,000 times growing up. Older brother understanding without explanation. They'd always had that connection, knowing each other's thoughts before words were spoken. "You're leaving," Dalton said quietly, statement, not question. "I know. I saw the letter when I came by last week to borrow your torque wrench. You left it on the kitchen table. Didn't hide it very well." Merritt felt his face flush with shame or anger, couldn't tell which. 19. There was no sarcasm in Dalton's voice, no hidden resentment, just the weary acceptance of someone who'd long ago recognized which brother had ambition and which had contentment. Merritt asked, and even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded, how much it revealed about priorities already decided. Dalton shrugged, the gesture of someone who'd learned not to want things beyond his reach. "Nothing changes for me. I stay here, work at the mill, marry Eleanor like we planned, buy a house on Maple Street if we can save enough, have 3 or 4 kids, teach them to fish in the Schuylkill River, grow old watching the steel stacks smoke. It's not a bad life, Merritt. It's just not your life. Never was." The kindness in those words made them cut deeper than any accusation. They stood in silence, two identical men on the cusp of diverging destinies, watching the night deepen over Reading. Moths circled the arc lights at the factory gate. A freight train rumbled past on the nearby tracks, carrying steel beams to some distant city. The American industrial machine grinding through the night, indifferent to the small human dramas played out in its shadow. "What will you tell them?" Dalton asked finally. "On the security forms. About family." Merritt had thought about this, rehearsed the words, tried to make them sound less monstrous than they felt. That I'm an only child, that my parents are dead, that there's nobody who could be compromised or used against me. Dalton absorbed this with a slow nod. "So I'll be dead. In your story. Not dead, just never existed. Is there a difference?" Merritt had no answer for that. 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, while Merritt was at home filling out the security questionnaire with careful block letters that looked nothing like his usual handwriting, federal agents came to the steel mill. They arrived in 2 black Fords, unmarked but unmistakable, the kind of vehicles that announced government business even without insignia. 4 men in dark suits and fedoras. They walked directly to Dalton's station in the fabrication shop where he was operating a punch press, cutting holes in steel plates with rhythmic precision. They showed badges. FBI. Said his name. __quote_28__. He confirmed it because lying to federal agents was its own crime. They placed him under arrest right there on the shop floor, oil-stained concrete and the roar of machinery drowning out his shocked questions. The charge: violation of the Sedition Act of 1918 as amended. Specifically, making statements intended to cause insubordination, disloyalty, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States. Someone had informed. 3 co-workers signed statements saying Dalton had criticized Roosevelt's foreign policy, had attended America First committee meetings, had argued that the war building in Europe wasn't America's concern. Witnesses swore he'd said these things over lunch breaks, in the locker room, at a union meeting. Whether he'd actually said them or whether someone needed to fill an arrest quota didn't matter. The machine had marked him. The machine would process him. The machine didn't make mistakes because the machine defined what mistakes were. They took him to the federal courthouse in downtown Reading, held him overnight in a basement cell that smelled of disinfectant and fear. The next morning, a public defender he'd never met told him he could fight the charges, but it would take months, maybe years. And in the meantime, he'd sit in jail without bail because sedition was considered a flight risk. Or he could plead guilty, accept 15 years at a federal penitentiary, and maybe get out in 10 with good behavior. The lawyer said this with the casual tone of someone offering a choice between sandwiches. Fighting means you rot in a cell here until trial. Pleading means you get sent to Leavenworth, where at least there's a library and a yard. Your choice. Dalton asked if he could make a phone call. They let him call the mill office. The supervisor who answered said Merritt had called in sick today, wasn't at work. Dalton asked them to relay a message. Quote 30. The supervisor, annoyed at being used as a messenger service, said he'd try to remember. Merritt received the news that evening. He was sitting at home, the completed security questionnaire in front of him, envelope addressed and stamped but not yet sealed. A neighbor knocked, the one who listened to a police scanner as a hobby, and said he'd heard Dalton had been arrested. Federal charges, serious stuff. Merritt's first reaction wasn't shock or horror, but a terrible, shameful sense of timing. He'd just finished writing "no siblings" on the form, had just committed to the lie. And now the universe had arranged circumstances to make the lie true, or true enough that nobody would question it. Dalton was gone, about to be buried in the federal prison system for a decade or more. Might as well be dead for all practical purposes. Merritt could mail this form, start his new life, and never look back. He should have run to the courthouse, should have demanded to see his brother, should have hired a real lawyer, found witnesses to contradict the informants, fought the charges with everything he had. That's what family meant. That's what twin brothers were supposed to do. But Merritt sat at the kitchen table for an hour, the envelope in his hands, and did nothing. Made no calls, sent no telegrams, filed no protests. The next morning, he walked to the post office and mailed the security questionnaire to Washington, walked back home, packed a single suitcase, gave notice at the mill, told his landlord he was leaving. Within a week, he was on a train heading south, watching Pennsylvania farmland roll past the window, trying not to think about Dalton in a cell waiting for someone who was never coming. Washington received him well. Young, talented, no family complications. Perfect material for the expanding wartime bureaucracy. They put him through a background check that would have detected lies if anyone had looked closely. But nobody looked closely, because why would they? He matched his documents. His fingerprints matched the ones on file from when he'd worked at a mill that did some government contract work years ago. Everything aligned. The investigators interviewed 3 people in Reading who confirmed. Merritt Kincaid, good worker, no political affiliations, parents dead, lived alone. Nobody mentioned a twin because nobody asked the right questions. And just like that, Merritt Ashford Kincaid was cleared for secret work. He threw himself into the job with manic intensity. Arrived early, stayed late, volunteered for every difficult assignment. Designed retooling processes for munitions factories that increased production by 30%. Calculated stress tolerances for artillery shells that reduced misfire rates. Drew up supply chain optimizations that saved the government millions. Within a year, he'd been promoted to department supervisor. Within 3 years, he was deputy director. By 1945, at age 35, he had a corner office, a government car, and the kind of access that made congressmen return his calls. He'd built exactly what he'd dreamed of: importance, influence, escape from the crushing grayness of mill work. And Dalton? Dalton was dying in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, 1,000 miles west of Washington, coughing blood into prison laundry, too weak to work his full shift, counting down days that blurred into an endless gray hell where the only distinction between one day and the next was which part of your body hurt worse. In winter of 1943, pneumonia swept through the prison population like wildfire through dead grass. 50 men died in 6 weeks. The prison administration, understaffed because the war had pulled away the younger guards and doctors, simply couldn't keep up. They triaged, saved who they could, let the rest go. Dalton was in the _32_32_ category. Too sick, too far gone, too few resources to waste on someone who probably wouldn't make it anyway. Merritt received official notification in March of 1943, a form letter on War Department letterhead, the kind sent to thousands of families during those years. We regret to inform you that prisoner Kincaid, Merritt A, federal inmate number 47829, has deceased of pneumonia complications. Date of death, March 12, 1943. Burial, Leavenworth Federal Cemetery, unmarked grave number 324. Personal effects to be returned to next of kin upon request. Merritt read this letter twice, 3 times, trying to feel something. Grief, guilt, relief, anything. But there was only numbness, a strange floating sensation, like the ground had disappeared beneath him and he was suspended in space with nothing to grab onto. His brother was dead. His twin. The person who'd shared a womb with him, who'd looked identical to him every day for 27 years, who'd known him better than anyone alive. Dead. And Merritt felt nothing. Or maybe what he felt was so huge and formless that it registered as nothing because his mind couldn't process it. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet at work, and never opened that drawer again. Never requested the personal effects, never asked about burial details, never visited the grave. Simply filed it away like an administrative matter concluded. Got back to work. Signed off on production quotas, approved factory expansions, calculated logistics for munitions shipments, became even more valuable, more indispensable, more successful. His brother's death became a footnote in a personnel file nobody would ever read. And this arrangement, this terrible bargain with circumstance, worked perfectly for 8 years. Until tonight. until a stranger walked into his office and said the unthinkable. Dalton was alive. Merritt stood at the window of his office for an hour after the stranger left, until the clock struck 1 in the morning and the night watchman knocked politely to ask if he was all right, if he needed anything. Merritt said he was fine, just working late, go back to your rounds. The guard left. Merritt was alone again with the photograph and the terrible mathematics of what it meant. If his brother died in March 1943, and this photo was taken in November 1942, that left 4 months unaccounted for. 4 months during which Merritt Kincaid, prisoner number 47829, could have escaped, or been released, or been misidentified in death, and survived the pneumonia epidemic that killed 50 others. 4 months of uncertainty, in which someone who should be dead became a ghost, a rumor, a stranger in a threadbare coat delivering impossible news. But the bigger question, the one that made Merritt's head spin with vertigo, wasn't whether Dalton survived. It was the name on the photograph. __quote _34__. Not Dalton. Merritt. The prison had recorded the inmate as Merritt Ashford Kincaid, 27 years old, arrested for sedition in August 1937. Which meant, what? That Dalton had been arrested under Merritt's name? That there'd been a mistake in the paperwork? Or, and this was the thought that made Merritt's hands shake so badly he had to grip the window frame to steady himself, that there'd been a deliberate swap. That at some point before or during the arrest, the brothers had switched identities. Dalton had gone to prison as Merritt, and Merritt had gone to Washington as Dalton. But when? How? Why? Merritt closed his eyes and tried to remember those days in August 1937 with forensic precision. Tried to reconstruct conversations, decisions, moments when such a switch could have occurred. The security questionnaire had asked about fingerprints. Everyone applying for clearance had to submit fingerprints. Merritt had gone to a police station in Reading to get them done. The officer had rolled his fingers across the ink pad, pressed them onto the card, filled in the name, Merritt A. Kincaid. But which fingers had those been? Merritt's or Dalton's? If they'd switched places before the fingerprinting, then the prints on file in Washington were Dalton's. Which would mean the real Merritt was the one in prison. Or vice versa. Or, God, it was impossible to think straight. Maybe they'd switched multiple times, for different parts of the process, until neither of them knew anymore who was who. Merritt walked back to his desk and picked up the photograph again. Stared at that gaunt face. Tried to see himself in it, or see his brother in it. Tried to find some distinguishing feature that would solve the mystery. But the face gave nothing away. It was their face. Both of theirs. Neither of theirs. A face that belonged to a person who might have been born Merritt and become Dalton, or born Dalton and become Merritt, or started as one and ended as neither. The caption didn't help. __quote _35__. That could be accurate, or could be a lie, or could be a confusion so deep that the truth had dissolved into meaninglessness. The telephone rang. Merritt nearly dropped the photograph. He answered on the 4th ring, buying time to steady his voice. __quote _36__. It was Harrison from the White House liaison office, voice tight with controlled urgency. __quote _37__. Merritt understood. Roosevelt was dead after 12 years of reshaping American government into his own image. Now, a former haberdasher from Missouri would take the reins, and there'd be chaos in every department as loyalties shifted and power structures realigned. People would be fired. New people would be hired. Security clearances would be reviewed. Backgrounds would be investigated again, more thoroughly this time, because Truman didn't know who to trust and would want to verify everything himself. This should have terrified Merritt. Should have sent him into panic at the thought of renewed background checks that might uncover discrepancies in his file. But instead, He felt a strange calm settle over him. Let them investigate. Let them dig. Let them find whatever there was to find. He was tired of running from a ghost, tired of maintaining a lie he could barely remember the origin of anymore. If his brother was alive, if Dalton had survived 8 years in hell and come back to Philadelphia seeking truth, then maybe it was time for truth. Maybe it was time to stop pretending and face whatever came next. He hung up the phone and made a decision. He'd find Dalton. Tonight. Before morning came and the machinery of government ground back into motion with new leadership and new demands. He had perhaps 6 hours of freedom before duty called him back. 6 hours to locate his brother, or his ghost, or his own alternate self. 6 hours to get answers to questions he'd been avoiding for 8 years. Merritt grabbed his coat and hat from the hook by the door, turned off the desk lamp, left the photograph where it lay on the blotter, that gaunt, accusing face staring up at the ceiling. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, moving fast, footsteps echoing in the marble stairwell. Pushed through the heavy brass doors onto Market Street where the night air hit him like cold water, shocking and clarifying. His car was parked 3 blocks away. Black Packard Super 8, government issue, assigned to senior staff. He got in, started the engine, and drove west through empty streets toward Reading. Toward the past. Toward answers or more questions. Impossible to say which. The drive through the dark countryside gave him time to think, to remember things he'd buried. Their childhood had been hard, but not unusually so for working-class kids in Pennsylvania. Father killed in France before they were born. Never knew him, just a photograph on the mantle and a folded flag in a box. Mother worked in a textile mill, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, fingers permanently stained with dye. She came home exhausted every night, barely enough energy to make dinner and check their homework. The twins had raised themselves in practical terms, learning to cook, to clean, to forge her signature on school forms when permission slips were needed. Dalton had taken the role of older brother seriously despite only 5 minutes seniority. When neighborhood kids tried to bully them, and twins were always targets, always considered weird, always suspect, Dalton would step forward first. Never violent, just firm, making it clear that getting to Merritt meant going through him first. When their mother got sick in 1926, tuberculosis that should have killed her but somehow didn't, Dalton worked 2 jobs at age 16 to pay for medicine. Found work at the mill doing cleanup on night shift, then went straight to a bakery for morning deliveries. Slept 4 hours a day and never complained. Merritt, meanwhile, stayed in school, studied hard, got good grades. Dalton insisted on it. One of us needs to make something of himself. That's you. I'm good with my hands. You're good with your head. Use it. Even then, even as teenagers, the division of labor was established. Dalton would sacrifice. Merritt would succeed. But there had been happiness, too. Summer evenings fishing in the Schuylkill River, sitting on opposite banks and seeing who could catch more. Winter weekends sledding down Cole Street Hill, taking turns on the one sled they shared. Spring mornings before school, shooting marbles in the alley behind their house. They'd been inseparable, completing each other's sentences, developing private jokes nobody else understood. Their mother used to say they were 2 halves of one soul split between 2 bodies. When one got sick, the other felt it. When one was happy, the other smiled without knowing why. Connection beyond words, beyond explanation. Except, Merritt had to be honest with himself in this dark car speeding through empty farmland. The connection hadn't been quite equal. Dalton had always known what Merritt was feeling. Merritt had been less perceptive about Dalton's interior life. Or maybe less interested. He'd taken Dalton's support for granted, assumed it would always be there, never questioned whether his brother might have his own dreams and frustrations. When Dalton said he was content to work at the mill, Merritt had believed him because it was convenient to believe. Had never asked, but what if you had other options? What if you could leave too? Would you want to? Reading appeared on the horizon, industrial smokestacks black against the pre-dawn sky like fingers clawing at stars. Merritt drove straight to 3rd Street, the area the mill secretary had mentioned. A row of flop houses and charity shelters where ex-convicts and down-on-their-luck laborers clustered. He parked at the corner and got out, expensive wool coat and fedora marking him as an outsider immediately. A few men sitting on stoops at 3 in the morning watched him with suspicious eyes. Government man. You could always spot them. Merritt approached the nearest building, a 3-story brick structure with a hand-painted sign. St. Vincent's Shelter, beds 25 cents. He went inside. The lobby smelled of carbolic soap and unwashed bodies and hopelessness. A nun sat at a desk reading by lamplight, rosary beads wrapped around her fingers. She looked up as Merritt entered, taking in his expensive clothes with a glance that wasn't quite disapproving, but wasn't welcoming either. "Help you?" "I'm looking for someone," Merritt said, pulling out the photograph. "This man. He might be staying here." The nun took the photo, held it close to the lamp, studied it carefully. "When was this taken?" 1942. "He looks different now, I'd imagine. Prison does that." She wasn't asking. Quote 46, quote 47. Merritt hesitated. What was the answer? Brother? Ghost? Stolen identity? The nun handed back the photo. The nun's expression softened slightly. "I'll tell you what I tell everyone who comes looking. If this person wants to be found by you, he'll make himself available. If not, that's his right. We don't aid in unwanted reunions, even family ones. Especially family ones sometimes." She went back to her book, conversation over. Merritt tried 3 more shelters with the same result, either genuine ignorance or protective stonewalling. These places served populations that had good reasons to avoid being found. Ex-convicts violated parole, men hiding from debts or wives or draft boards. The shelter staff weren't about to betray them to someone in a government coat asking questions. By 5 a.m., Merritt was exhausted and no closer to finding Dalton. He sat in his car and rubbed his face, feeling stubble rough under his palms. He needed to get back to Philadelphia, change clothes, be at his office by 6. Duty called. The country's leadership was in transition, and vital work couldn't wait for personal crises. But as he started the engine, something caught his eye. Movement in an alley across the street. A figure stepping out of the shadows, backlit by a street lamp. Thin, hunched, wearing a coat that had been mended many times. The figure stopped at the alley entrance and looked directly at Merritt's car. Even at this distance, even in the poor light, the face was unmistakable. His own face. Older, thinner, weathered. But his face. Their face. Merritt got out of the car slowly, afraid any sudden movement would make the apparition vanish. They stood 30 feet apart, 2 identical men in the empty pre-dawn street of a dying industrial town. Merritt wanted to call out, but his voice failed. What would he even say? Dalton? Merritt? Brother? Ghost? The other man didn't approach, just stood there watching, waiting. After a long moment he gestured, a small jerk of his head toward the alley he'd emerged from. An invitation. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness. Merritt followed. The alley was narrow, walls of brick on both sides, trash bins and broken crates scattered along the pavement. It opened into a small courtyard behind the buildings, a space probably meant for deliveries but abandoned now, weeds pushing through cracked concrete. The man in the threadbare coat stood in the center of the courtyard, hands in pockets, breath visible in the cold air. Morning light was just starting to touch the top of the eastern wall, a pale gray promise of dawn. "You look good," the man said. Dalton's voice, but rougher, like sandpaper over wood. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 53, underscore, underscore. Merritt couldn't find words, stood mute, staring at his brother, or his reflection, or whatever this was. "Cat got your tongue? Or did you forget how to talk to people like me? People who've been where I've been?" "I thought you were dead," Merritt managed finally. "They sent me a letter. Official War Department notification. You died in March '43. I almost did. Pneumonia. Probably should have. 49 other men in my cell block didn't make it. But something in me was too stubborn, or too angry, or too confused to let go. I woke up 3 weeks later in the prison infirmary, more skeleton than man, and a doctor was standing over me saying, 'Jesus Christ, you're still alive.' Like it was a miracle or a curse or both." Dalton moved closer, close enough that Merritt could see details. The network of fine scars on his hands from prison labor, the gray already threading through hair that should still be dark brown at 35, the way his coat collar was worn through at the edges from years of friction against skin. They kept me in the infirmary for 2 months. By the time I was strong enough to work again, there'd been an administrative shuffle. New warden, new guards, new system. My file got lost in the transition. Or misfiled. Or deliberately hidden, I'll never know. The pneumonia epidemic had killed so many prisoners that the paperwork was a disaster. Death certificates got issued for convenience, to close files and reduce the official prisoner count. Make the warden's statistics look better. Prisoner Kincaid, M.A., deceased March 12, 1943. That was supposed to be me. But I didn't stay dead. What happened? Merritt's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Quote 60, quote 61. Merritt began, then stopped, the logical contradiction catching in his throat like a fishbone. Dalton smiled, a sad twisting of lips that had forgotten how to smile properly. Quote 62. Quote 63, Merritt admitted. The truth of that admission felt like stepping off a cliff into water too deep to measure. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 64, underscore, underscore. Dalton studied him with those hollow eyes that had seen things Merritt couldn't imagine. There's a third possibility. Maybe we switched so many times for so many small reasons over so many years that neither of us remembers who we started as. You know how it was growing up. We used to swap places for fun. You'd take my shift at the mill when I was sick. I'd take your exam when you were anxious. We'd trade dates with girls just to see if they'd notice. We were always fluid, always interchangeable. Maybe that fluidity just continued, deepened, until the moment came when it mattered, really mattered, and neither of us could say with certainty which name belonged to which body anymore. The sun was rising now, real light replacing the gray pre-dawn murk. In the growing illumination, Merritt could see his brother's face more clearly. Could see not just the damage, the sunken cheeks, the premature aging, the tooth missing on the left side, but also the fundamental sameness. This was still his face, still their face, still the genetic code they'd shared since conception, written in bone structure and eye color and the precise curve of their ears. "What do you want from me?" Merritt asked. "Confession? Apology? What?" "I'm dying," Dalton said simply. "Tuberculosis. Got it in prison, same disease that almost killed our mother. Spread to my spine, my lungs. Doctor at the Veterans Clinic gave me 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm unlucky. I came back to Reading to die, figured I'd end where I started. But before I go, I need to know the truth. Not for revenge. I'm too tired for revenge. Not for justice. There's no such thing in this world. Just for completion. Need to know which one of us I am. Because I can't die not knowing. Can't let my last thought be, who am I?" Merritt felt something break open inside his chest, a dam he'd built 8 years ago finally cracking under pressure. His brother said slowly, testing the name like an unfamiliar tool. Merritt spread his hands helplessly. Quote 74. They stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the cold courtyard by degrees. Somewhere nearby, a train whistle blew, the Reading Railroad carrying steel to war factories, indifferent to human confusion. Dalton reached into his coat and pulled out a paper, folded many times until it was small as a playing card. He unfolded it carefully, the creases threatening to tear. __quote _75 __, he said, holding it out. __quote _76 Merritt. Took the document. It was genuine. County seal, doctor's signature, all correct. Date of birth matched. Name matched the person Dalton believed himself to be. But Merritt had an identical certificate at home, also genuine, bearing the name Merritt Ashford Kincaid. Same date, same hospital. 2 certificates, 2 names, one identity split between them like an atom fissioned. We both have these, Merritt said. Mine says I'm Merritt. Yours says you're Dalton. But birth certificates can be forged, or switched. Or we could have been labeled wrong at birth. Sometimes happened with twins. The only way to know for certain would be the birthmarks. You had yours on the left shoulder. I had mine on the right. Dalton was already shrugging off his coat, then his shirt, baring his upper body to the cold morning air. His torso was a geography of suffering. Ribs visible through skin, scars from untreated infections, the waxy discoloration of tuberculosis lesions, and on the left shoulder blade, a brown birthmark shaped vaguely like a comma. Left side, he said. So, I'm Dalton, right? Merritt felt his certainty crumble like a house built on sand. I have mine on the right shoulder, or I did, last time I checked. He hadn't looked in years, hadn't thought about it. The birthmark had always been there, a genetic footnote, meaningless except as a way for their mother to tell them apart when they were infants. Now it was the only remaining proof of who was who. He took off his own coat and shirt, aware of how different his body looked. Well-fed, soft, unmarked by hardship, the body of a man who'd spent 8 years behind a desk while his twin had spent them in a prison yard. And on his right shoulder, the matching birthmark. Comma pointing the opposite direction, mirror image. 2 halves of a pair. __quote _82 he confirmed. __quote _83 . But even as he said it, a doubt crept in. A memory from childhood, fuzzy and uncertain. Their mother, drunk on cheap whiskey one night after a particularly hard shift, crying about how she couldn't tell them apart, how she'd put different colored ribbons on their cribs to distinguish them, but kept mixing them up. __quote _84 she'd sobbed. Maybe I got confused and Dalton became Merritt and Merritt became Dalton and I never knew. They'd laughed it off at the time, 2 boys embarrassed by their mother's breakdown. But what if she'd been telling truth? What if the primary identity confusion predated 1937 by decades? Merritt said slowly, the logical implications spreading through his mind like cracks in ice. __quote _87 __. Dalton pulled his shirt back on, fumbling with buttons that didn't want to cooperate with fingers half numb from cold and disease. So that's the answer. There is no answer. We're both real and both fake. Both Merritt and both Dalton. Both of us and neither of us. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You know what the worst part is? It doesn't matter. Whether I'm really Dalton who suffered unjustly or really Merritt who got what I deserved, the result is the same. 8 years of my life gone. 8 years of your success built on that absence. The machine processed us and spit out 2 half people, neither complete, neither whole. Merritt wanted to argue but couldn't. The truth of it was too heavy, too absolute. They stood facing each other in the growing daylight, 2 men who shared everything except a life. Merritt asked. Dalton cut him off. Merritt felt time pressing on him, the obligation to return to Philadelphia, to responsibility, to the lie he'd built his life on. But he couldn't leave it like this. Couldn't let his brother, or whoever this man was, just fade back into the shadows. There's a boarding house on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, Merritt said quickly, writing the address on a scrap of paper from his wallet. Run by a widow named Mrs. Kowalski. Tell her I sent you. She'll give you a room, won't ask questions. I'll make sure there's money for rent and food. Medical care if you'll accept it. You don't have to see me again if you don't want to. But at least let me know you're not dying in an alley somewhere. Dalton took the paper, looked at it, folded it carefully. Why? Guilt? Maybe. Or maybe because, despite everything, you're still my brother. Still the person who shared a womb with me, who grew up beside me, who sacrificed for me whether intentionally or accidentally. That has to mean something, has to obligate me somehow. Obligation, Dalton repeated, tasting the word. Is that what binds us? Not love, not blood, but obligation? I don't know what else to call it. All the normal words don't fit anymore. But whatever it is, it's real. As real as these birthmarks. As real as the fact that we have the same face even if we're not sure who that face belongs to. They stood in silence for another moment. Then Dalton nodded slowly. All right, I'll go to this boarding house. For as long as I have left. But understand, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I'm tired and sick and have nowhere else to go. Don't mistake necessity for forgiveness. I wouldn't dare, Merritt said. And he meant it. They parted without shaking hands, without embracing, without any of the gestures that might mark reconciliation or closure. Just two identical men walking in opposite directions out of a courtyard in Reading, Pennsylvania, as the sun rose on April 13, 1945, the day after Roosevelt died and the world began its complicated pivot from one era to another. Merritt drove back to Philadelphia through morning traffic, other cars filling the roads now, workers heading to factories, families beginning their days, the ordinary machinery of life grinding forward while his own life felt suspended in amber. He made it to his office by 7 a.m., late by the standards of the emergency, but early enough that his absence hadn't been noted. The office was chaos, staffers running between rooms, phones ringing constantly, secretaries typing urgent memos. Truman had been sworn in. New orders were being issued. Everything old was being questioned. Everything new was being scrutinized. Merritt threw himself into work with the same manic intensity he'd employed for 8 years, using labor as anesthetic against thought. Reviewed contracts, approved requisitions, briefed new officials. Stayed at his desk until midnight, then went home, collapsed into bed, slept fitfully. Rose at 5 a.m. and did it again. Days blurred together. The transition from Roosevelt to Truman, from wartime to the beginnings of peace as Germany collapsed and Japan stood alone, from one version of America to another. And through it all, in the back of his mind, the knowledge that somewhere across town, in a boarding house on Walnut Street, his brother was dying. Or was it his brother? Or was it himself dying while his brother thrived? The question had no answer but asked itself anyway, relentless, unyielding, a philosophical riddle that had become flesh and taken up residence in his conscience. He visited once, 3 weeks after their meeting in Reading, showed up at the boarding house on a Saturday afternoon with a basket of food and a bottle of whiskey. Mrs. Kowalski let him in, pointed upstairs to room 7. Merritt climbed the narrow staircase, knocked on the door. No answer. Knocked again. Finally, Dalton's voice, weak. __, quote _105 __. The room was small, neat, Spartan. A bed, a chair, a dresser, a window overlooking the street. Dalton lay on the bed fully dressed, thinner than he'd been 3 weeks ago, skin yellowing in a way that suggested liver failure along with the tuberculosis. You look terrible, Merritt said, setting the basket on the dresser. You look the same, Dalton replied. That should make me hate you, but I'm too tired to hate. Hate requires energy I don't have. Have you seen a doctor? Mrs. Kowalski brought one. He gave me pills, told me to rest, said I have maybe 3 months, maybe less if I'm lucky. The dark humor in "if I'm lucky" wasn't lost on either of them. They talked for an hour, carefully avoiding the big subjects, sticking to small talk about the weather, the war news, the new president. It was almost pleasant in its superficiality, two strangers passing time rather than two brothers grappling with existential confusion. When Merritt stood to leave, Dalton stopped him. Merritt felt his throat tighten. Merritt left the boarding house with tears streaming down his face, the first tears he'd cried since his mother died 17 years ago. Drove home. Sat in his apartment staring at the wall until dawn. Dalton died on February 3, 1946, 10 months after their reunion. Mrs. Kowalski called Merritt at work. "Your brother passed this morning, peacefully, in his sleep. He left a note for you." Merritt picked up the note that evening. It was brief, written in handwriting identical to his own. "I'm leaving first. You'll follow eventually. Maybe we'll meet on the other side and God will explain which of us was which. Or maybe there is no other side and the confusion ends with death. Either way, thank you for the last few months. They weren't happy, but they were less lonely than the alternative. D or M or whoever I was." Merritt arranged the funeral. Small ceremony at a municipal cemetery, just him and Mrs. Kowalski and a priest who'd never met the deceased. They lowered the plain pine coffin into the ground. The gravestone read simply, __quote _ 119 __. No epitaph, no ornament, just the name and dates. Merritt stood by the grave after the others left, staring at those carved letters, wondering if they represented truth or fiction or something in between that had no name. Life continued. The war ended. Truman proved more capable than anyone expected. The economy boomed. Merritt's career flourished. He rose to assistant secretary by 1953. His work on post-war industrial conversion won commendations. By the time he retired in 1968 at age 58, he had a government pension, a comfortable apartment, and respect from colleagues who'd never known about the brother who'd never existed in official records. But retirement was harder than work. Work had provided distraction, purpose, a reason to avoid introspection. Without it, Merritt had too much time to think, to remember, to question everything he'd built. He developed habits to fill the void, long walks through the city, afternoons at the library reading history books, evenings at the symphony. But none of it quite worked. None of it filled the hole where certainty should have been. He never married. Came close once in the late 50s, a woman from Philadelphia society, intelligent and kind, who seemed genuinely interested in him. They dated for 2 years. She proposed moving in together. He agreed. They lasted 6 months before she left. __quote _120 __, she'd said on her way out. "You're in the room, but you're not present. It's like living with a ghost. I can't do it anymore." She was right. He was a ghost. Had been since 1937, since the moment he chose career over brother, ambition over loyalty. Or maybe he'd been a ghost his whole life, one half of a pair that should never have been split, an incomplete person pretending to be whole. The question didn't have an answer, but it haunted him anyway. In 1972, at age 62, Merritt had a dream that felt more real than waking life. He was in a prison cell, bare concrete and iron bars. His brother stood outside, keys in hand, looking at him with an expression of profound sadness. In the dream, they switched places. Merritt stepped out, Dalton stepped in, the door clanged shut. But then they switched again, and again, trading places faster and faster until Merritt couldn't tell which side of the bars he was on, couldn't tell if he was free or imprisoned, couldn't tell who he was or where he belonged. He woke sweating, tangled in sheets, the dream's logic still wrapped around his consciousness like chains. He got up, went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror. An old man looked back, 62 years old, gray hair, wrinkled face, but still recognizable as the boy from Reading who dreamed of escaping. Still the same face Dalton had shared, still carrying both identities in one skull. He spoke to the mirror. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 122, underscore, underscore. The reflection didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The question was unanswerable. Merritt Ashford Kincaid died on November 14, 1975, in his brownstone apartment in Georgetown. Heart attack. The cleaning lady found him 3 days later, slumped over his desk, a half-written letter in front of him. The letter began, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 123, underscore, underscore, and then stopped mid-sentence, ink trailing off as if the writer had lost consciousness or lost certainty about what came next. His obituary in the Washington Post was brief, quote, 1, 2, 4. They gave him military honors, though he'd never worn a uniform. 3-volley salute, flag folded with crisp precision, presented to nobody. No family to receive it. The cemetery office filed it away in a warehouse where unclaimed flags waited for relatives who would never come. But in a pauper's cemetery in Philadelphia, another grave held another Kincaid. 2 graves, 2 names, 1 man split between them. Or 2 men combined into one mystery. Or something else entirely that language couldn't capture. Years later, a graduate student researching World War II loyalty investigations stumbled across the discrepancy in the National Archives. 2 personnel files for Kincaid M.A. One showed a highly placed government official with spotless credentials. The other showed a convicted seditionist who died in federal prison. Same birth date, same physical description, same fingerprints. Or were they? The student requested the actual fingerprint cards. They'd been lost. Destroyed in a fire in 1959, along with thousands of other documents. No way to verify. The student dug deeper, found birth certificates for twins, Dalton and Merritt Kincaid. Found conflicting arrest records. Found a death certificate for underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 127 underscore, underscore, dated 1943. And another for underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 128 underscore, underscore, dated 1946. Found an obituary for underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 129 underscore, underscore, dated 1975. The timeline made no sense. 3 deaths for 2 people? Or 2 deaths for 1 person recorded twice? Or legitimate deaths of actual brothers whose records got confused by bureaucratic error? The student wrote a paper analyzing the discrepancies, concluded that clerical mistakes during wartime chaos had created a phantom duplicate in the records, submitted it to a historical journal, received a form rejection. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 130 underscore, underscore. The paper was filed away. The mystery remained unsolved because nobody with power cared enough to solve it. In the great machinery of history, what did it matter if 2 brothers got confused in the records? Millions had died in the war. Millions more had been displaced, traumatized, broken. What were 2 identical twins compared to that ocean of suffering? But for those 2 men, it had been everything. Their entire lives shaped by one moment in 1937 when a choice was made, or forced, or accidentally manifested. Everything that followed grew from that moment like a tree from a seed. One went to prison. One went to Washington. One died young after suffering. One lived long and died comfortable. Which was which? Did it matter? Could anyone say with certainty where Dalton ended and Merritt began, or vice versa? The graves keep their secrets. The documents contradict themselves. The truth dissolved into bureaucratic confusion decades ago, and no amount of research will resurrect it. All that remains are questions. Did they conspire to switch identities? Did one betray the other? Did both suffer? Did neither win? Are they buried in the right graves, or the wrong ones? Did the man in Arlington earn his honors or steal them? Did the man in the pauper's cemetery deserve his anonymity, or should his name be inscribed in stone somewhere with honors? No answers, only the permanent maybe. the ghost of possibility haunting the graveyard of certainty. Two identical men whose lives diverged at a crucial moment and never converged again. Two names carved in stone in different cemeteries, marking bodies that may or may not correspond to the names. Two files in the National Archives telling contradictory stories about the same person or different people who happen to be born the same and die apart. This is the story of the Kincaid brothers. Or it isn't. Maybe it's the story of one man split between two lives, or two men compressed into one identity, or the story of how bureaucracy and war and fear and ambition can take human beings and process them until even they don't know who they are anymore. Whatever it is, it's true. Or false. Or both. Or neither. The only certainty is uncertainty. The only truth is ambiguity. The only answer is the question that never stops asking itself: who am I?